Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. I want to welcome to the program Richard Slotkin, cultural critic, historian, professor of English and American Studies at Wesleyan University, which is sort of where I wanted to go to school, but I didn't get it. Author of A Great Disorder, National Myth, and the Battle for America. Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Let's talk about the, let's first start with the idea of myth.
Yes.
Generically speaking, what does a national myth, or a sub-national myth is part of the story here. What does that mean? Why do they exist?
Well, basically a national myth is the stories that have been developed over time to explain the origins and the historical movement, historical direction of America, of any nation state, since most of them do have national myths. It's a use of history to place people in a ongoing frame of collective action, collective belonging.
Does it come from a certain insecurity on some level? Because there's a quality of like backfilling and rationalizing.
Well, yeah,
historical things. Like,
just to step back for a second, the national myths really arise from crises in the development of a society, of a nation state. So when you have a crisis like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, it forces people to think, what is the society really all about? And so a story forms around that situation, which then is told and retold and elaborated and explained, and above all is used as an analogy for interpreting something that's happening in the present. Now that's where the notion of insecurity comes in, that you resort to your myths, you need your myths when you're in some kind of crisis. So you look for some kind of analogy to explain where you are. Example I like to use is Pearl Harbor, that when the Twin Towers were hit on 9/11, the first analogy that people brought up was Pearl Harbor. Well, Pearl Harbor is a story. A story is a myth. And once you know that you're in the framework, or you're using Pearl Harbor as an analogy for your crisis, you know that it's a serious crisis, and you also know what you have to do about it, which is to say, go to war.
Well, I mean, but the implication of a myth too is that part of it's not true, right? I mean that if there was an event that we all as a society experienced that was exclusively positive, I don't know if that's such a thing as possible, but let's say it was just exclusively positive. Do you need a myth around it, or is it like, you don't. Well, you need a myth. It's people are disposed to tell stories to explain things, and the stories that make up a national myth at the core, they have something that is true in the sense of factual. There was, in fact, an American Revolution. We did have a Western frontier. We did have a Civil War. We did have what I call the Good War. We had World War II that transformed the way America relates to the world. These are true events. The use that you make of those events when you interpret it, use them to interpret a present crisis, that is like a fiction. That is because 9/11 wasn't Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is Pearl Harbor. 9/11 is 9/11. And that's where the fictional element comes in. But because there's a core of truth to it, it's a very credible fiction.
Well, it's also used, I think, I guess I could pose this as a question for you, Richard. Are myths there to serve as power or to justify what the government wants to do in certain moments, to mythologize the past, to justify actions in the present?
Absolutely. That is, it is there. It does. It's not there for that purpose, but it does serve that purpose. And according to one of the theories of nation-state formation, national myths were developed by the political classes that organized national government. So it is related. It is useful to those in power. But the story itself is the property of everyone who belongs to the culture. So, for example, you have the use of the Civil War in a crisis like the Charlottesville demonstrations. And you have one side using the lost cause version, the Southern version of the Civil War, waving the Confederate flag. You have the other side invoking Abraham Lincoln and the war for the Union. The myth is a cultural property that can be used by any group. But I guess the core of what you're saying and what I'd like to do is it's political at its core, whether it's being used by protesters and rebels or it's being used by the government. It's political at its core.
All right, let's get into the specific myths that you do talk about. The first is the myth of the frontier.
Right.
Walk us through what that myth is, and why it was developed.
Okay, that's the first American myth, and it develops out of the fact that we are a settler state. The society begins as European colonies who grow and expand through the wilderness over a course of about 300 years. So you have a 300-year story of westward expansion that is the core of the myth of the frontier. Now, in that story of expansion, there are two elements. One is an economic element, and that is the idea that America grows fantastically prosperous by exploiting new natural resources, and that the profits from that aren't simply small, but they're windfall profits. You go from being a colony of Great Britain to being the most powerful nation on the face of the earth in the space of less than 100 years. That's phenomenal growth. The second element in frontier myth is what I call savage war. And that is that to get the frontier, you have to displace the indigenous peoples. So at the core of this American idea of us as a westward expanding nation is an idea of race warfare. And that the primary distinction between that is at the core of American nationality is the distinction between white settlers and the non-white indigenous. That's the core of that myth.
And it occurs to me too that what it also does is it defines frontier from a specific perspective.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like
sure.
Like the frontier. It wasn't the frontier for the indigenous people. It was home. And like, what does that by defining the frontier that way, does that in some way sort of like diminish or essentially I want to say whitewash, but it really sort of like almost it could complete erasure of that sort of like contradiction that exists there?
It certainly takes the settler point of view, and let's call it the orthodox version of the myth is that version. Cowboys good, Indians bad. But the other side of it is, remember, we're dealing with stories, right? And the frontier myth brings the indigenous peoples into the American story, at first as an opponent, but then what I want to say, as an alternative. If you think about the romances of Fenimore Cooper, if you think of some of the recent films about Westerns that take the Native American point of view, it's available through the myth as an alternative to the way that we developed. And you can see as things go forward, when you question the growth economy and when you question white supremacy, the Native American becomes a very important symbol of resistance, balance rather than growth, and what I want to say, racial reciprocity rather than white supremacy. See, the power of myth partly relies in its simplicity.
but its enduring power comes from its complexity. There's a contradiction in there, and that's what gives it its appeal and its power.
And so what is its utility? I mean, I can, even today, I can see how it's like exploited to aggrandize, entrepreneurs, let's say. I mean, like they're, what is it? Come in and destroy everything and, break things as to sort of like recreate a new frontier or something.
Right.
But what's been the utility of that through the years?
Mainly what you just said, that is mainly it has rationalized the development of a corporate economy that's in which growth, which is to say profit, is the all important thing. There are alternative elements within the myth, but the dominant strain is certainly what I just said.
That's fascinating, and it allows for also to sort of say like, and growth is in part, you're appropriating or extracting, or someone pays a price, but that's just part of the myth.
Yeah, one of the other things that's erased in the frontier myth is labor. The notion of profiting from you think about it, the great thing would be like an oil bonanza or the fracking bonanza. It's a resource bonanza. But you don't think about the labor that goes into developing it and the rights of the workers who are helping you exploit the resource. The other classic example is slavery in the South, where the southern frontier is a slave labor frontier, but the frontier myth discounts that.
Let's talk also about the I guess of the four big myths. You talk about the myth of the founding.
Right. Yeah, and that is the idea that the United States as a nation was formed by this group of extraordinarily wise and virtuous white men who developed a set of ideas and a set of laws that are perfect for the creation of a democratic nation state. Declaration of Independence is the principles: all men created equal, government by consent of the governed, and the Constitution is the legal regime, balance, checks and balances, and the supremacy of law. We invoke that so often, every time the Supreme Court issues a decision, especially when you're dealing with the originalists. They're invoking a story or a myth of the founding that assigns it extraordinary moral and legal authority. In the book, the thing that the current thing that I focus on most is gun rights, which is the gun rights movement, which has rooted itself in a version of a particular interpretation of the Second Amendment and mythologized that version so that it becomes a license to do just about anything you want, including arming yourself to overthrow the government.
And it's fascinating. There's almost like a 200 year span in which it's sort of like it reaches it makes its real move on some level. It's like like one of those Bruce Lee kidney punches. It happens, and then 3 weeks later, your kidney fails or something like that. But how does the within the context of the founding, the sort of like general founding fathers myth, reconcile the difference between these two documents, right? Like the Declaration of Independence is a revolutionary document,
right?
Attacking the establishment. The Constitution is, in many respects, the creation of a new establishment,
right? Like,
how does that? And this is this happens with any revolutionary government. Yes. How do they all of a sudden justify having a government when we just got through saying like there's a lot of problems with the government?
The beauty in the myth of the founding is precisely the contradiction you just pointed to, which is to say you can use it to rationalize a rebellion, and you can use it to rationalize suppressing the rebellion. And again, myth arises from a crisis. A crisis implies a contradiction, a choice in the frontier between living like an Indian and living like a settler.
a choice between revolution and order. And you can't resolve those contradictions. They're just there. The myth, as it's told, as it's used, balances it one way or balances it another.
Let's move to the myth of the Civil War. There was really a couple that came out of the Civil War, and maybe more than any of these myths, it has been. It's really these myths have really had an ongoing revision. I mean, these are still in play.
Yes, yeah, all of them are still in play. The Civil War. You've got the three versions. You've got the Union version or the liberation version. Save the Union, liberate the slaves. Abraham Lincoln is the hero. You've got what I called the White Reunion. It was just a war between white brothers, North and South. They reconciled, they recognized each other's bravery, and forget about the black people. And then the third one is the Lost Cause, which is that the South was right, and that violence is justified to either defend white supremacy, which is to say to secede from the Union, or to restore white supremacy after Reconstruction is instituted. And these are really powerful and have ongoing through the society since the Civil War.
What are the circumstances when those get invoked, I guess, or how do they animate what we see today? I mean, well, maybe we should talk about the good war, and then we'll talk about how all of these myths is sort of like impact today.
Yeah. But the thing about the good war, based on World War II, and really it really contains the New Deal, but it really applies New Deal principles to the Second World War. And it's the only one of the myths that is not white-centered, because the myth envisions America not as a white man's society, but as a multi-ethnic platoon, and indeed a multiracial platoon that unite, in which the diverse population unites to fight a war of liberation against racist powers. And I guess to connect it back to the Civil War, you asked when the Civil War is invoked. It's invoked when the primary question is, what role does race play in defining what America is and who Americans are? So that you got, excuse me, between like 1865 and 1925, you had a kind of shift from the possibility of a multiracial democracy, Reconstruction, to the rejection of that, and the acceptance, North and South, that white supremacy was necessary to be reestablished in the South. But this is also the age of massive immigration. And one of the things that the Civil War myth gets applied to is defining the difference between the existing white population, mainly Northern European, and the new immigrant white population, East European, Southern European, but also Asian. And there's a movement towards what I call ethno-nationalism in the turn of the century period that the Civil War, and particularly the Lost Cause myth, plays a big role. Now, the good war rises in direct contradiction to that ethno-nationalist tendency. And the reason that it happens is that you simply cannot fight a 20th century war with by excluding minorities.
By only having a white army.
That's right. You can't do it. It cannot be done. You need the soldiers, and you need the financial support of the communities. I did a book called Lost Battalions about the First World War, and if you look at that period, in the space of about a year, the government goes from saying you can't trust any of these immigrants to saying, oh, America is is not a racial society. It's a multi-ethnic society. It's anyone who believes in American principles can be an American, and it doesn't last. There's a snapback, but that's a sign of things to come. That when the bigger test of the World War II comes, they go back to that, and really makes it between 1940 and 1970 a huge transformation occurs.
And having grown up in the era of like those type of war movies, which were so platoon focused. I mean, obviously there's Platoon, but like all of them have like, and you know, Spielberg is the perfect example of like, if you want somebody who is sort of fully embraced a myth and regurgitating it back to Americans, you know, Saving Private Ryan, like you can just go right down the line. Like, you know, I know what the casting office looked like. We're going to need one guy who's going to play Italian. We're going to need one guy who's looking Irish. We're going to need one African-American. We're going to need one, you know, this is the way that it's going to work. And everybody's going to be called some variant of their, hey, he's Philly and he's, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah. Interestingly, there were no African-Americans in Saving Private Ryan.
Oh, geez.
In the Platoon. No. But your slip is really critical because the original Platoon movies made during World War II, the two big ones, Bataan and Sahara, both have black guys in the platoon at a time when the U.S. Army was segregated. Hollywood is projecting an image of an idealized country that doesn't exist.
Well,
and
also,
selling it as the war. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm curious too how America's role in fighting the Nazis also plays into that myth, right? Of the United States as kind of a beacon of multiculturalism versus the Nazis exterminating the Jews and many other minorities, LGBTQ people as well. Like, you know, we, I think in the period since then have, because of the growth that happened after World War II, mythologized our role in it and say, like, not talked about how the Soviet Union lost 20 million people fighting the Nazis, for example. Yeah,
that's true. And also not facing up to the fact that the army was segregated, that Jews and blacks were discriminated against in the service, blacks even worse than in World War I, actually. Blacks had a harder time getting into combat units in World War II than in World War I. Jews and blacks were routinely denied medals that they had earned in combat. So it's not real. It is a fiction, but it's very powerful fiction. And one of the things that I try to do is that once you've got this paradigm, you can. It's like a tracer. It's like banding the leg of a bird. You can follow the platoon from 1940 through 2002. And one of the things you see, the Spielberg example, I think is an excellent example, is a kind of reversion to a more segregated view, a nostalgia in Spielberg, I see, for a whiter world. In the other movie that I deal with in the book a lot is Black Hawk Down, where you have a black versus white is the story of that movie, and the only black soldier in the platoon, only one black soldier, breaks down at one point. He fails to shoot a black woman who's charging the position. And the white guy, she's got a gun or a grenade, I forget what it is. And so the white troops have to shoot her. That is within the framework of the story. We can inflect it to reflect the ideological drift of our times. And I see that drift as a drift towards MAGA.
We should say that was about in Mogadishu. The movie took place there. Was that incident true?
Oh yeah, that's based on a real incident. And
no. I mean that the black soldier could not shoot.
No, totally made up.
and that's the same dynamic too in Saving Private Ryan, where there's a guy who can't shoot the German prisoner, and it comes back to haunt them in some way.
Right.
So all right, so let's move to the sort of the third part of the book, because, Barack Obama is a big turning point, but it's funny, like just when we were talking about the ethno-nationalism that was deployed against Southern Europeans in the first part of the 20th century, we're 36 hours or 24 hours away from J.D. Vance talking about how, just as an example, when ethnics get together in enclaves, you get crime.
Right.
Like he's talking about gangs of New York.
That's right.
Literally just sort of, I guess, to just sort of prove your point on how these sort of myths are deployed.
Yeah.
But what was that drift about? Because in the wake of World War II, we have this myth of the platoon, which implies that like everybody's, we're all Americans, and we're all on board. And even through the Reagan years, I just saw a clip of Reagan saying like, America's the only place where you can come from anywhere and become an American. You can't do that. You can't go to Japan and become a Japanese person, and you can't go to France and become French. What happens over that time? Because there's a certain durability, as you're right, like it gets combined with the New Deal, and there's a certain durability to that through at least, the mid 60s, while we have this great compression where there's literally less income inequality than any other period in our country's history. Right. Where does this drift? Where does it go? Is it a certain insecurity that is associated with white people becoming supposedly not the majority, the so-called majority? Is it the loss of jobs that comes with like sort of globalism? What begins to sort of like put us into this new, what you call MAGA era?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. Let me take it from a mythological point of view. Let's just assume, for the sake of the discussion, that this liberal social order was connected with the myth of the good war. So if you abuse the myth of the good war, if you get us into bad wars, you discredit not only the warfighting part of it, you discredit everything that the warfighting part brought with it. And I think that's one of the things that happened, that Vietnam really did a job on this country. And the attempts in the 90s of the Bush administration, the two Bush administrations really, to recover from what they called Vietnam syndrome, got us into wars that turned out to be bad wars, pointless wars, costly wars, and wars that, at least in the case of Iraq, were based on falsehood. It was charitably bad intelligence, but perhaps false intelligence. So the idea that fool me once, shame on me; fool me twice, fool me three times, get me into three bad wars, and maybe I think that we shouldn't get into wars at all. And so you get the part of MAGA, which has been characterized as isolationist, goes with that. Now, I think that there is also, in addition to that, a cultural reaction against the racial liberalism and the sexual liberalism that we associate with the 1960s, 1970s. That there's a reaction against that. It coalesces around when Obama is president, but it's definitely present in the society before that. You see that in Reagan, in the Reagan years. You see it most emphatically in Pat Buchanan's declaration of culture war in the 1992 presidential primary campaign. And that really has become the focus of the cultural agenda of the MAGA movement, is the reaction against those the racial and gender liberation. Now, the racial part is a concern about a loss of social power.
by whites. And the gender and sexual part is about the loss of moral authority, the right to say what is good and what is bad, what is permitted and what is not permitted. If you lose that, that's a real loss. If you thought you had that authority and it's been taken away from you, that is a real loss. That's going to hit you. And that's, I think, why we're experiencing the power of that snapback against those liberating movements.
Longtime listeners of this program will remember back in 2016, 2017, there was an ongoing argument on this program about that loss of social relevance, and known as the zero-sum wars here on our program. But the idea, I mean, I would explain it as like when I was a kid growing up in the 70s and the 80s, there was nothing I could see in our culture that was not essentially centering me as a white kid. Like the commercials were focused on my mother, but my mother doing stuff for me or future me as dad.
Yes.
The TV shows, whatever it was, they were all from essentially either my perspective as a kid or my perspective as I grow through the years, but nobody else's.
Right.
And that changes, and it creates a certain anxiety, I guess, on some level.
And exploited by the Breitbarts of the world, right? Where they meld the kind of cultural anxiety and that what Sam is describing there, and put it into a political context of culture, politics being downstream from culture too. That backlash to Hollywood and to art or popular culture moving past what you describe, Richard.
Yes. Well, we're getting here. You think about, we're talking about mass media and the cultural function of mass media, which is to give us an image of ourselves. When the media change that image in a radical way, it makes a real difference. I'm thinking about when I was in graduate school in the early '60s. I remember when a Black person came on in an advertisement, we would call, my wife and I would call each other in from the other room, come and look and see, because it was such an extraordinary thing to occur. It's not at all extraordinary now. It's the norm. You can even see interracial couples normalized as the people who buy rugs, the people who have homeowners insurance. And that to people who are, I would say, any older than 40, there's a big difference there. That's really and truly changed, and you feel it.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, as it's the first day of the DNC as it begins today. What are the competing myths that we see between red and blue, as you write about? Because you write essentially that the conservatives, broadly speaking, have been far better in deploying myths in the context of politics than progressives or liberals, I guess, as we delineate that for us. And has that changed at various times?
Yeah, at the moment, MAGA has really, at this point, I think, two myths that they feature most prominently. One is the lost cause, that they're going to restore a lost social and cultural order, and the prosperity that presumably went with it. It carries with it a commitment to the frontier, the values of the frontier, and things like that. But it's the scenario. That is the narrative that they're living, is the lost cause, struggling to restore an order that liberals have overthrown. And the second piece of their puzzle, intimately connected with that, is the founding Second Amendment myth, that in order to do that, you need to be armed. You have to be able to arm yourself, at least to threaten violence, in order to carry out your program, and you are entitled to that by the Constitution as well as by the Declaration of Independence. And those are clear. Those are very clear stories. It's a very clear scene. You could make a movie out of that. You can call it Gone with the Wind. If you look at the mythological or the historical reference of the Democrats at this point, I really see two. One of which is the New Deal, and the other, to a certain extent, the Good War because of Ukraine. And the third one is the Civil Rights Movement. Now, it's a curious fact that the New Deal, which was an utterly transformative period in American political history, is not the center of its own mythology. There is no myth of the New Deal. You couldn't name 3 movies that deal with labor organizing in the 1930s or with any of Roosevelt's infrastructure projects. I can think of one. Remember, I saw one movie about the TVA starring Montgomery Clift, I think. It's just not a story. It's subsumed in the World War II story. And to the extent that Ukraine is central to the Democrats, yeah, there's still a good war story. But the New Deal is really critical. And Biden really made that current. He really brought that back into the discourse in a way that it was never under Obama and never under Clinton. They didn't like the New Deal. They were more into neoliberalism, that is the corporate growth as the key to, was that the rising tide lifts all boats.
Right.
Which is a nice way to say trickle down economics. And the third one, the civil rights movement, it's a myth in the sense that if I say civil rights movement, you got Martin Luther King in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and we're home. And of course, you've got the Civil War myth there with Lincoln behind King. But it did not become, in my sense of the term, a national myth that is connected to the politics of the nation state. It became the story of individual groups seeking their right by following the script, the Martin Luther King script. So it became a myth of identity politics. And what Obama really started to do, and Biden and Harris are doing, I think, is to nationalize that myth, along with the New Deal. I'm talking here about an imaginative use of historical analogies by political leaders to give a sense of context to the movement that they're leading. Whether they become myths or not is not for us to say. They either do or they don't. The public either says, that's a history I want to be a part of. As my grandfather wanted to be a part of the myth of the frontier. This is a history I want to be a part of.
Are there things you're seeing in Harris's language that are at least sort of like attempting to pull into those less, I guess, discreetly defined myths that the Democrats or the center left have embodied? I mean, I'm over, I'm projecting a little bit on this, but the Harris and Walz have both used like freedom as a thing, which is not a typical. The last time you really heard freedom associated with a Democratic politician, it seems to me, was either freedom from government, maybe under like Bill Clinton, or Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, where you can employ that sort of like a narrative of freedom from want, freedom from freedom to follow religion, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that's implicit in a way in what Harris is doing, but it hasn't been said yet.
Right.
What I'm listening for is, first of all, to what extent the policies reflect the kinds of things you were just talking about, but also the framing, the story that frames it. What do we bring in
to give context to that word freedom. Second Amendment is freedom. Is that where we're going with this? If not, we got to hear it. I haven't heard it yet.
They're talking about basically
Bodily
abortion.
autonomy.
Yeah, bodily autonomy. Yeah, but again, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Those are bigger. Those are more totalizing. And my point would be, they're Rooseveltian.
Right.
They're New Dealian. They're invoking. They're putting you in this historical frame rather than that historical frame. And I think that's an important thing to do. I don't know how it will affect the election. God knows what affects elections at this point. But I think that in the long term for the culture, that's an important thing to do. And one of the things that Biden in his campaign did do, and which I talk about in the book, is he framed his policy statements. He did at Gettysburg. And that was his civil rights liberation, connecting it to Abraham Lincoln and Gettysburg and Civil War, the liberating Civil War. And then he did a speech at Warm Springs, Georgia, which was his New Deal speech, connecting to Warm Springs, which is so associated with FDR. So he did that. He made those moves. He didn't follow up on it to my satisfaction. But it was a move. It was made. It was put into the discourse, and I'm looking to see what Harris and Walz do in that regard.
Is it possible to, if as somebody in power or seeking power, adequately mythologize the struggle of, say, the civil rights movement? Because, like, when we're talking about how that has come into cultural consciousness, Reagan was the president that made MLK Day a national holiday. And in fact, like, a lot of people just think he was about love and good feelings as opposed to the struggle. Like, when we're talking about popular culture, I think about Mississippi burning and how that was the portrayal of the FBI was the ones who they really were the liberators for Black people in this country. Like we still have a really long way to go, I think, in terms of adequately talking about the blood that was spilled and the struggle of what it means to actually fight for equality, as opposed to saying, hug thy neighbor. The freedom, I think, rhetoric is better, but is it even possible for a politician to encompass that?
I hope so. I think there were some attempts that were made over the last couple of years around the death of John Lewis and the recall of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the demonstrations in Birmingham, the controversy, the discussions around the voting rights, the failed Voting Rights Act, brought up specifically the notion of struggle. In connection with civil rights, and connected it to an issue that affects everyone, which is to say voting rights. So I think gestures have been made in that direction. No one storytelling incident or episode makes a myth. It's repetition. It's the fact that people come back to it and do it again. Oh, that's so good. I have to repeat that. I have to find another version of that. I have to find a sequel. I have to find a prequel that brings the story into currency and use. And again, I see a tendency towards it, but let's see what use is actually made of it.
We will indeed have an opportunity to see if they're going to deploy something that dramatic, at least in terms of rhetoric, this week. Richard Slotkin, cultural critic, historian, professor of English and American Studies at Wesleyan University. His latest, A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Good talking with you.
You too. Bye-bye. Bye. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.